Hey everybody, I'm Chef AJ and welcome to Healthy Living. Today I'm really excited to interview Dr. Lance Dodes. This is the first time that I'm meeting him, but I've read his books and they're super interesting. One of them is called Breaking Addiction, one of them is called The Heart of Addiction, and one of them is called The Sober Truth. So please welcome Dr. Lance Dodes. It's so nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Yeah. And let me just tell you where I heard of you, because you're probably wondering, well, why is a chef interviewing a doctor? Well, I'm a little bit more than a chef because I actually run a program about food addiction. So addiction is something that I'm very, very interested in. And your take on it is completely different than most of us have heard or learned. And again, I want to tell people if what they're doing is working for them, keep doing it. But you have some pretty compelling evidence that some of these programs don't work. And so let's just jump right in, because it was the sober truth that brought me to you, because two of my colleagues who have written books, Dr. Howard Jacobson and Dr. Pam Popper, had mentioned your book, The Sober Truth. And in that book, you talk about how 12-step programs not only don't work, but in fact may harm people. And that's not something I've heard before, because you always hear about them. Well, the people that are in them for which they're working, of course, love them. But I had no idea that, at least you're talking about AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, that something like for 90% of the people, it not only doesn't work, but that it actually harms them. That's not something that most people would know.
Well, that's right. Actually, that was why I wrote the book, because I was talking with a colleague and I said, you know, the statistics show that AA has about a 5% success rate. And he said, wow, I didn't know that. I said, well, you know, everybody knows that. He said, actually, nobody knows that except some few people in the field. So I wrote the book. So, yeah, there have been many, many studies, and we reviewed all of them up to the time of publication of the book, 2014. And they confirm that. AA has a success rate between 5 and 8%, basically. So, as you said, the people for whom it works should stay in it, and if they're doing well, that's wonderful. The problem is that everyone thinks that it is the right treatment for everybody, which it certainly is not. And also, people say, well, I might as well go because why not? And the reason why not is because an enormous number of people have been harmed by being forced to go to a program that can't help them. And part of the reason for that is that they believe it's the right answer, so it must be them. And AA, unfortunately, contributes to that because AA has a slogan, it works if you work it. And people believe that.
Yeah.
That is absolutely not true. We have a ton of evidence that that is not true. People have worked very, very hard at 12-step programs, but it doesn't work, and it's not their fault.
Right.
But they feel worse about themselves because they think it is their fault.
Sure.
If only they worked harder, you know?
Before we continue, I just want to make sure that you're in frame. I'm only saying, could you just move your computer just a little bit, because I'm worried that the top of your head is going to be getting cut off. So if you could just a little bit more, even. Yes, better. Thank you so much.
Well, I can lower my chair too. Hold on.
Perfect. I didn't want to interrupt, but what you're saying is so brilliant that it would break my heart that afterwards, if we only see you like this. You know, I'm not familiar with AA, but I'm familiar with a lot of the food addiction programs, and the clients that come to me from them say the same thing, that they feel very beaten up because they're told, well, it didn't work because there's something wrong with you. Well, maybe there is something wrong with the program. And is this research about just AA, or is it for all addiction programs? Because they have addiction programs for almost everything now.
Well, it's true for all 12-step programs.
12-step programs.
Right. But all of the 12, as you know, all of the 12-step programs are exactly the same. They have the same 12 steps. What they do is substitute for alcohol another drug or another behavior like eating. But they're all the same. So there's no reason why people haven't studied every single one of them, but there's no reason why one of them would be any more successful than the others. And the success rate, as I said, is bad. And that, again, the problem, when I say this to people, they say, well, what else have you got? And that misses the point, which is it's actually harmful. We should be careful not to send people to something that'll make them feel worse, which is commonly the case.
Right.
Again, the people that it's good.
Absolutely. People that it's good for, we're not telling you not to do it. Please keep doing it. Because I just interviewed a doctor about these food addiction programs and about how weighing and measuring your food for the rest of your life, in his opinion, was ludicrous and unsustainable. And I got a lot of hate mail, and I kept saying, if it works for you, keep doing it. But I want to help the people for whom this is not working. And I think this is fantastic. You know, I've never gone to a 12-step program, but when I was in my 20s, I suffered from depression, and my psychiatrist told me to go to a 12-step program called Emotional Health Anonymous. And I went to one meeting, and I ran out the door so fast. Because what I didn't like about that meeting is one of the things that they required us to say is that I am powerless over this. And I didn't want to say that because I felt if I'm going to say I'm powerless, then I am powerless. And I didn't feel I was powerless. So I went to one meeting and I never, ever went back to any 12-step program because I didn't like that feeling of saying, because I'm not powerless. At least I didn't want to admit it because I didn't feel I was. And it's the same thing with food. I don't feel I'm powerless over food. What are your thoughts about having to say that you're powerless?
Well, I completely agree. In fact, the whole thrust of my idea is the reverse of that, is that you can be empowered once you understand it. One of the things that has happened in our culture is that people suffering with an addiction are seen as somehow different from the rest of human beings. They're either immoral, which is completely wrong, or they're stupid, or they're self-centered. All of that is wrong. And one of the things that's wrong about it is that people seem to think that understanding doesn't apply to them, but it does. It's just that they haven't had a chance to really understand what lies behind the addiction. Once you understand it, it turns out there's quite a bit you can do. You can control your life in the way that everyone controls his life.
And we're going to talk about, after we're done with this 12 steps up, there's so many questions I have about the addiction. But you know what I was thinking, because I read the Breaking Addiction twice, and
you wanted me to show the book?
Oh yes, please, because I left a lot of my notes in the car. Breaking Addiction. That, for those of you that are not worried about 12-step programs, I'd probably recommend that one. You know, if you're not going to a 12-step or need to know that information. But one of the things I started thinking is I used to smoke cigarettes. I hate to admit that, but I did, from the age of 19 to the age of 25. And you know, you would probably agree that nicotine is a physically addictive substance. And I was very lucky that I broke my rib in the 80s, when those days doctors taped you. And they don't do that anymore, but they tape you so tight that you can barely breathe. And so for 6 weeks, I did not smoke cigarettes. And when I got the tape off, I was over the physical addiction of cigarettes. There's other reasons we do addictions than the physical part. And I never smoked again. And I never wanted to smoke again. But I didn't have to keep going somewhere to not smoke. Do you know what I'm saying? And so it's not that I have please, because I know I'm going to get a lot of bash. It's not that I have a problem with these addiction programs, but it seems to me that the people that go have to go for the rest of their life. And if that works for them, that's fine. But I don't have time to do that. So what's your take on that?
Right. Well, one of the things that you said, and you're very clear about it, which is wonderful, but most people are not clear about the difference between physical addiction and psychological addiction. And you described it exactly. There are lots of drugs that are physically addicting. But that, even though it seems like it has to do with addiction, it actually has nothing at all to do with the problem that people keep taking it. For example, almost every adult in our country drinks. And if you drink enough, you will become physically addicted. You can't help it. It's your body. But that doesn't mean you're an alcoholic. The point of alcoholism is that people they use it, and then they can stop it for a while. There's no physical addiction. But they go back to using it. And lots of alcoholics have no physical addiction at all. They just don't drink long enough to have it. Binge drinkers, for example. So physical addiction is a real issue, but that's not why people keep going back.
Right.
And the other mistake is, and let me just say, and the reason they keep going back is what I wrote my books about. There's a psychological basis for it, which can be understood. But the other big mistake is that everyone has heard lately about this brain disease idea. Addiction is a brain disease. And the Surgeon General recently came out and said that. That's actually been proved false. The interesting thing about it is people like the idea because it's sort of a new kind of brain thing. It seems sophisticated. You know, you release dopamine in your brain and all that. Well, you do release dopamine in your brain. But that, again, is not what causes addiction. And we know that for a fact because this experiment has been run literally millions of times, where you take people, you physically addict them to large amounts of drugs like heroin, and then it turns out they don't become addicts. The theory, the brain disease theory, is that their brain now has a disease and they can't help being addicts. It just isn't so. In fact, not only are there literally millions of counterexamples that show that isn't true, but there are no examples that show it is true. There is not a single person who has ever been, to run the experiment, you'd have to take somebody, physically addict them, and then see if you made them into a diseased addict. There is no examples of that. There are, but everyone believes it because it sounds
Well,
scientific.
it's funny because we both live in Los Angeles, and I don't know if you've seen these commercials, but I turn them on for, I don't know the name of the program. It's to treat some addiction. I don't know what it is, alcohol or drugs. And they say, and the first thing is because addiction is a disease. And a lot of people say they have what I believe is called the DRD2 gene, that they're born with this gene, and so they're predisposed to addiction. And
It's not true. In fact, people have been looking for genes that associated with addiction for 50 or 60 years, and no one has ever found one. The only gene that they ever found is a well-known gene, which is the one that causes what's called Asian flush sometimes, which is present in people of Asian ancestry and Native Americans. But what that does is it makes you sick when you drink. It's exactly the same. It causes the same chemical problem as the drug antabuse. It makes you feel sick if you drink. But that obviously doesn't lead to alcoholism. If anything, it would lead to less alcohol use, which is the case in Japan, for example.
Right. Well, you talked about in your book how with the soldiers that were taking heroin basically because it was there, but they came home and they didn't remain addicted to heroin, which I thought was fascinating because we always are told, maybe to scare us to not take drugs, that the minute if you take heroin or cocaine, that's it, you're going to become addicted.
Right. And the Vietnam study was very important for this, and it actually disproved this brain disease idea, as you're saying. If taking a large amount of drugs could cause you to become an addict, then they all would have been addicts. In fact, practically none of them ever used it again.
Wow. Again, one of the things I love to do when interviewing people is I don't always interview people that I agree with 100%, because I'm not sure how I stand on this. But if you're correct, and I think it's a good chance you are, I think you're going to piss some people off, because a lot of people...
I've already pissed people
I know, because I actually found something about you that was not favorable, because it seems like if somebody identifies as a person that is an addict because they have a brain disease, and you're saying, no, that's not correct, they might be angry.
Yeah, it's kind of sad, because the other problem with the brain disease idea is that it has no treatment. So it would be nice for them if they didn't believe that, which... not only because it's not true, but then they might get some treatment that really can help them.
Right.
Because people with addictions are just like everybody else. And as I said, if you understand how it works emotionally, then you can manage it.
Right. And we're going to talk about that. But first, I want to ask you, do you believe that one of the ways to manage an addiction is at least with abstinence? So in other words, if you are a person that's either predisposed to alcoholism or maybe identifies an alcoholic, would it be best then to not drink alcohol, even if you can manage the other parts of the addiction that you're going to talk about in a minute?
Well, sure. I mean, there's no question that abstinence turns out to be the best way of approaching it for people who have an addiction. I mean, it's safer, it's easier actually than trying to. Let's talk about it. Applies to all addictions, but we can talk about alcohol.
Sure.
It's easier in your life to just not drink than to decide which times you can safely drink.
Sure.
So that certainly is a good idea. But abstinence itself is not if abstinence worked, if the decision to be absent worked, then there would be no alcoholics, because people don't want to have their lives ruined. Right. So unfortunately, so there's nothing wrong with it, but it's not really a treatment.
Right. How did you get into? I mean, you're a psychiatrist, right? You practice in Los Angeles, and I know you've had impressive credentials that we're going to put in the show notes. But how did you specifically get interested in addiction?
Well, by accident. When I was in my psychiatry training back in Boston, we learned nothing at all about addiction. But fortunately, as I moved along, I was surrounded by some of the most, at that time, people who were the most important figures in trying to understand addiction psychologically. So I learned from them, and then I went on from there. And when I was, my first job was being the head of a psychiatry consultation liaison service in a general hospital. But they needed to fill their beds. They had empty beds, so I suggested they start an alcoholism unit. And so I learned more about it. And then I started doing my own research, and so that's how I got into it. I'm a psychoanalyst, and so I became very interested in understanding the deeper roots what made people do that. And not to jump ahead, but one of the things I discovered, which I think is critically important, is that addiction is not different from other compulsive behaviors, things you feel you have to do.
Right.
And it's important to understand that, because we don't have, if you have to arrange the items on your desk so that they're all parallel,
Which
to
I
each
do.
other, you know, a lot of people have compulsions like that. And we don't have a desk arrangers anonymous, because
Right.
it doesn't make sense. What you would do is you would say, let's figure out what this means to you to have to do it. For example, does it mean that you're trying to get your life in order by getting your desk in order? So that was one of the things I discovered, and that was helpful to me to explain addiction.
Right. But so there's a difference between an addiction, a compulsion, and even a habit, right? Sometimes they seem to intersect, but they're different.
Well, habits are certainly different. Addictions and compulsions, I think, fall into the same group.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I like to say addictions are a subset of compulsions. And one of the reasons I say that is because if you talk to real people, they shift between addictions and compulsions. The story about cleaning, I wrote in one of my books. I had a patient who had very serious alcoholism, and one day she stopped drinking, but she couldn't stop cleaning her house.
Wow.
So this was not a great mystery. She had shifted the compulsion to drink to the compulsion to clean. And, we understood that they were the same, and we eventually worked out what that was all about. But it's not unusual to do that. Some addictions are named compulsions, like compulsive gambling.
Mm-hmm.
Compulsive gambling is an addiction.
Or compulsive eating, right?
Or compulsive eating.
Sure.
So the reason there are a lot of reasons why they get confused, but addictions historically have been associated with drugs.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't have to be, as you know. So, and people regularly shift from drug addictions to non-drug addictions all the time.
All the time.
And so those non-drug addictions are essentially identical to compulsions, and so are drug addictions. Habits are different. Habits, the main difference between a habit and an addiction or a compulsion is that habits have no meaning. They have no deeper meaning. There's nothing you can psychoanalyze about a habit. It's a habit. It's something that and for that reason, you can break habits pretty easily. By willpower, for example. But we all know willpower doesn't work for addiction.
Not for addiction, right?
Right. So that they can look the same, but they're very different.
Could it sometimes intersect? And what I mean by that is if somebody says, coffee, for example, caffeine can be addictive for some people, alcohol to some people. So if somebody has to have a cup of coffee every morning or an alcoholic beverage at a certain time every day, is it possible it could be both a habit and an addiction at the same time?
Yes, which makes things tougher when you're trying to diagnose it. But again, I have some illustrations in my books of exactly that. I mean, I have a cup of coffee every morning. I don't know what I would do without it.
But you're not addicted. It's not an addiction, though. It's a habit.
It's not an addiction. First of all, it's not a physical addiction because I don't drink enough.
Right.
But also, it's not a psychological addiction because if I'm busy or I have to run out of the house or something, I can do without it. It's no problem. Right. It doesn't mean anything to me. But if every time I was stressed and I felt overwhelmed, I had to have a cup of coffee, then it would be a compulsion. It would be something I had to do to relieve my emotional stress. Right. That's how addictions work.
Right. Well, okay, so how do you, Dr. Dodes, define an addiction?
Well, an addiction I'm trying to explain this without using the jargon. Addiction is something that you feel compelled to do in certain circumstances. It's not something you choose to do in the sense that it's a rational decision. You may rationalize it. You may say, I have a very good reason for this. But in fact, it's controlling you. The urge is overpowering to repeat the behavior because it's solving a problem. The problem it solves is generally a feeling of helplessness. People feel overwhelmingly helpless. It's quite normal. It's not a problem. It's normal to feel that you have to do something. I often use the analogy of being in a cave. If you're stuck in a cave and you can't get out, you're going to scream and shout, and you might even break your wrist hitting at the rocks, but no one's going to call you self-destructive because you're hitting it at the rock, as people say about folks with addictions all the time. You're just trying to get out, and that's normal. So what happens in an addiction is people feel overwhelmingly helpless, and they need to do something. But the something they do is what we call a displacement, or you could say a substitute.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, let's say that you have a person who is sensitive to being cut off in traffic. Okay, he's driving along and somebody cuts him off. Now, let's say he says, oh my God, this is emotionally meaningful to me. He's cutting me off, he's cutting me down, he's disrespecting me. It has some personal meaning. So he now feels this overwhelming rage to deal with this. Now, if he drives up and cuts off the other person and takes out a hammer and starts beating on his hood, this is very bad, it's road rage. But it's not an addiction. However, if he feels overwhelmingly helpless and he has this rage at helplessness, and instead of doing that, he drives off the road and goes to a bar and has to start drinking, that's alcoholism.
Mm-hmm.
Difference is that he dealt with his helplessness and his rage at helplessness by displacing and substituting another action. The other action is the addiction. If he had driven off the road and instead of getting a drink, he had gone directly to a casino and compulsively started betting, we'd give the addiction a different name. We'd say you're a compulsive gambler. But the mechanism is the same.
Right. Or if they went to Baskin Robbins and had a triple hot fudge sundae. So,
Yes,
because I've often heard that
that's
people
right.
with addictions generally don't overcome their addictions. They just often substitute one behavior for another. So, for example, from what I've heard, at least in the old days when people would go to AA, there'd be a lot of donuts because, you know, they had the alcohol.
And
Now they're
cigarettes.
having sugar. Or people that are overcoming a food addiction often turn to exercise. Or people that like are in prison, they often turn to you know, spiritual things. And again, you know, so have you noticed that as well, that if people don't deal with the original source of the helplessness, that they're just going to be chasing one feel-good means to, you know, to another?
Absolutely, unless they get therapy.
Right.
But I want to emphasize, it's not only that it's feel good, because a lot of times people say they do it, they wish they didn't. They weren't even
Right.
having a good time, but they had to do it.
Right.
And then it feels more like the ordinary kind of compulsion, where you say, I have to get this straight on my desk. It's not that I'm enjoying myself, but I have to do it.
They just can't not do it. In other words,
They can't not do it. That's right.
once that rage or whatever that feeling comes over them, then they have to execute the behavior, whether it's the eating, the drinking, or
Exactly.
so on. Yeah.
Exactly.
But so dopamine really, you know, it's just that I interview so many people that talk about dopamine and talk about the dopamine reward cascade, and then how
Right.
when we engage in these things like recreational drugs or alcohol or hyperpalatable foods, we're increasing more dopamine in our brain. So it seems that at least maybe initially there is some pleasure for some people doing these behaviors. So you're saying that has nothing to do with it. There's the pleasure
Oh, no.
seeking.
No, I'm just saying, see, this again, there are two truths here. They're both true, but only one of them explains the addiction. Yes, dopamine is released in your brain when you have some pleasurable activity. There's no question about that.
Mhm.
But when you eat, for example, and you have something that's pleasurable, we all have dopamine released in
Right.
our brains, but we're not all food addicts.
Right.
So that's the distinction. What people are describing is true about the brain function, but it doesn't explain addiction.
Mhm.
To explain addiction, you'd have to understand why somebody who does this then goes ahead and does it when he feels overwhelmed, because he feels overwhelmed.
Right.
That's not about seeking enjoyment.
Exactly. But that would require people to do deeper emotional work, like getting therapy, which it seems like nobody wants to do. Like I've interviewed Dr. Roger Gould, who is an emotional eating expert at UCLA, wrote a book called Shrink Yourself. And his whole foundation is on this, that people do need to do, you know, the deeper work to figure out why they're doing it. But it doesn't seem like anybody really wants to do it.
Well, another reason why I wrote the books is that, yes, as a psychoanalyst, I see people intensively and for long periods, so I'm totally down with that.
Yeah.
But it turns out you can do a certain amount by yourself, and that's why I wrote the books, because I don't expect it to be a substitute for therapy.
Right.
But there's something you can really understand about this, and I've heard from many people how helped they are by doing that. They don't resolve all the problems in their lives. For that, they would need to see somebody.
Mm-hmm.
But they can really get a handle on the addiction by seeing how it works, because one of the things this enables you to do is to anticipate the next time you're going to have an addictive urge.
Mm-hmm.
If you have somebody with a food addiction, for example, you put a giant, beautiful cake in front of them, that's going to be a tough moment. Or if you have an alcoholism, you put a beer in front of them. But if you can predict, if you know that next Tuesday at 4 o'clock you're going to have an addictive urge, that would be a big help. There are lots of things you could do. It seems magical, but there's nothing magical about it, because once you understand what makes you in particular feel overwhelmingly helpless, now you can predict when that's going to occur. And I can't tell you how many of my patients do exactly that. Almost literally what I just said. They know exactly when the addictive urge is going to be upon them because they know themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So it really is a way to, that doesn't mean they don't have an issue, but it means they can manage it. It also helps, once you understand what the main issues are inside of you that enable you to predict the addiction, it also helps to understand yourself in general, why you have all the other anxieties and things that bother you, because you're only one person. So the issue that bothers you, that leads you to an addiction, is also the issue that bothers you in every other way.
Right. So even though you believe that addiction is not a neurological or a brain disease, do you think there is even a slightly genetic component in that? It does seem that people that have it in their family often develop it. Maybe it's just from watching what mom and dad did. Like, is there ever anything genetic about this at all? Or no, it's just if you have overwhelming self-helplessness, you're probably going to develop an addiction.
Well, you said something interesting. You said that you watch mom and dad do it.
Mm-hmm.
That is true, but that's not genetic.
Right.
That's identification with the parent.
Okay, sure.
That's something that happens once you're born with whatever genes you have. And in my first book, I should show you my first book.
Yeah, The Heart of Addiction. And I like your books because even though you're a doctor, I was able to read them. They weren't so academic that I couldn't understand them. So thank you for that. Yeah.
You don't want to read my academic things.
Yeah.
But no, but the point is that in the first book, I reviewed all the genetic studies up to the date of that book.
Oops.
Especially alcoholism often runs in families. So people look at that to see what the fact when something runs in families, you can't tell whether it's genes or whether it's the environment.
Right.
So there have been all kinds of ways to try to study that. Among them is adoption studies. You take somebody who is the child of two parents or one parent, usually who has alcoholism, and they've been adopted out, and now they're being raised by another couple who does not presumably have alcoholism. So you can then see if that child is more likely to have alcoholism, then maybe it was the genes rather than the environment. Mm-hmm. Well, there have been a lot of those studies, and they're completely inconclusive because some of the kids grow up to have alcoholism, and some of them don't. Plus, when they went back and looked at the studies again, it turned out, unfortunately, some of the adoptive parents had alcoholism. Mm. So, as I say, I reviewed all the studies. There are lots of studies about it. The one I like to mention is a study done on twins. A good way to study genetics is to study two people who have the same genes.
Sure.
Identical twins. So the question is, if one of a set of twins has alcoholism, his twin, does the twin have alcoholism? Well, if it's in the genes, if one has alcoholism, the other one will have alcoholism, right? That isn't the case. The fact is, if one of them has alcoholism, the chances are better that the twin does not have alcoholism. Same genes.
Interesting.
So there are lots of issues with the genetics. Is there some genetic loading? That is, some genetic influence? Mm-hmm. There may be. But one of the problems with the studies is that since they don't actually understand addiction, the people who do the studies, they're only looking at something like alcohol. But what happens if you have someone who now is a compulsive gambler, never had a drop of alcohol? Should we count that or not count that? Mm-hmm. And they don't count it. So because they don't really understand the broad way in which addictions are expressed, the studies are not, I'm afraid, worth that much. But right. We know for sure that addiction is not a genetic disease like inheriting your eye color or something like that.
Right, but a lot of people believe that, and if it works for them, that's fine. How many people do you think suffer from addictions, like in the United States, or is it just everyone, or are there people that just don't have any? Maybe like my husband, he doesn't seem to have any addictions.
Well, the numbers are hard to figure because you have to start depends how narrowly you focus. There's something like 15 or 20 million alcoholics, for example. But, then there are the people who are using other drugs, and then there are the compulsive gamblers and the compulsive eaters and the compulsive exercisers and so forth.
Sex. Some people are sex addicts, or they identify with that. Yep.
Exactly, exactly. So who knows? But it would not be crazy to say there might be 40 or 50 million people who we would say have an addiction. But again, I stress that these people are no different from anyone else.
Right.
You know, so I'm not sure what the label does for you.
Right. Well, the reason I wanted to bring up the label is because I have found that a lot of people don't like the label. I mean, some people like it because it keeps them on the straight and narrow because they feel that they have a brain disease, and as long as they avoid the substances that are triggering it. I'm just trying to get information here because I want to understand this, because it helps me understand myself and the way my life went, because I identify as somebody who is a recovering, that's the key word, food addict. I used to weigh almost 200 pounds. I'm not anymore. And when I look back, it wasn't that I was eating too much food necessarily. It was I was eating the wrong food, specifically sugar and flour. And when I stopped eating those foods, which I believe, at least for me, were addictive, and some of the doctors I've interviewed said they were, I wasn't eating too much food. But when I think back about what you say about the addiction, the root being this overwhelming sense of helplessness, I think about the time that I was most worse in the throes of my addiction was when my baby died. And I remember a chef said to me, I was taking a cooking class. I'm a professional chef, and in this class there was no dessert, and I was basically just eating dessert like all day, every day, Slurpees and Cokes, and there was no dessert in this class. I said, "There's no dessert." I was mad. He goes, and he said, "You're eating so much sugar to substitute for the lack of sweetness in your life." And I said, but then when I look back, but a lot of these things develop in childhood. Like when I think about that, I'm from a very dysfunctional, abusive family. That's when my eating started, because I did have an overwhelming sense of helplessness when my psychotic father would torture my dog and beat up my brothers. Well, what could I do? I couldn't go to the bar and get a drink, and I guess I could have cleaned my house, but so now what you say now, when I really think about it, it makes total sense.
Yeah, and one of the things that the people who like to think that they have a brain disease, what they don't seem to notice also is that addictive urges are not random. And you don't have them all the time. I mean, as you're pointing out, you have them at a particularly stressful, horrible time in your life. But just on a daily basis, although there are some people who, for example, drink every day, mostly people don't. There are some, of course. But mostly they say, I had a drink, or I drank too much, or I had a binge, or I drank for a couple of weeks, but I haven't drunk now for a while, but then I drink again. That's the most common pattern. So the brain disease, if you had one, which you don't, would be constant. So you would have the same. It would be like having diabetes. You always have diabetes, and it doesn't matter what your mood is.
I think I'm getting this now. So what you're saying is, if this was really a brain disease, then abstinence would never be possible. Because you couldn't, because even when people are in the throes of addiction, abstinence, sometimes they can go days, weeks, months, years without eating sugar or flour or drinking. So if this was a brain disease, like I have hypothyroidism, I guess that's in my brain, right? I don't know, but the point is
so do I, by the way, but it's in your thyroid.
Right. Okay. Sorry, but what I'm saying is, you mentioned diabetes. It's like, if it truly was a brain disease, then you would have to do it every day, no matter what. Then even abstinence could never, ever be possible. Because am I understanding this correctly? Because this is important stuff for a lot of people.
Oh, sure. I mean, you'd be absent if someone held a gun to your head for a while, but it doesn't change the overwhelming urge to do it. And that's why people relapse. And then they feel ashamed of themselves.
Right.
Because they either buy the 12-step idea that they're weak, which is wrong, or they haven't, worked hard enough, or they buy the the brain disease part, and they say, oh my God, my brain is not functioning. Neither of which is true. If they understood it, if they said, I know why I feel that urge today, because thus and so just happened. And again, the books are filled with many, many examples of this, and they're different for different people. Well, then, now they know why they have the urge. And one of the things they can do even after the fact, I was talking about anticipating it, but when they feel the urge, once they understand what triggered it emotionally, what made them feel overwhelmed, they can often do something about it. And, there are lots of things you can do. I mean, one of the things the most common thing is people realize when they're in a situation that they're thinking about having a drink or eating, it doesn't matter. And so when they think that, okay, I'm thinking about it, what am I not doing now? How am I not responding to this helplessness? And then they respond to it, if they can. They speak up. or they leave a place that they don't want to be in, or they do something else. So they don't do something that, if I can tell a short vignette.
Of course. Just really quickly, it sounds to me like addiction, by your definition, is just this ultimate act of displacement.
Yes, it is, and it's driven, right. So I had a patient, this is also in the book, I had a patient who, whenever her addiction involved using pills. They were, it was oxycodone, I think. Anyway, so she had an addiction. She was using this drug. So her husband was very domineering, and he would call her up in the middle of the day and say, "I'm bringing business guests home for dinner. Make dinner for 7 people." And she would say, she hated these dinners, of course. She would say, "Yes, dear." She would hang up the phone and then go to the medicine cabinet and take her pills, and then she would go make dinner. So she felt helpless because she was part of her problem was that she needed to be so meek and helpless with her husband. But she had to do something, so she took the pills. Well, she began to understand this, because this was not the only way in which she repeated this pattern. For example, the PTA, she had small kids, the PTA would call up and say, would you run the bake sale for us? And because she had to be so meek, she would say yes, and then she would go take pills, same thing. Well, she got better. And so when the PTA next called, she said she had the urge to use the pills, but she said, "No, I'm not doing the bake sale this year. I'm busy." And she didn't need to take the pills. Well, she came in one day and she said, "He did it again, my husband. He called up, same thing, make dinner, so forth." And she said, I know what I should have done. I should have said, "Make your own damn dinner." She said, "But I couldn't do that." And she said, so unfortunately, she said, "Yes, dear," and she hung up. And she said, "I walked over to the medicine cabinet and I opened it up and I'm looking at my bottle of pills there. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, I can understand this. What is this about?" She says, I could have called them back, but I can't quite do that yet. She said, "But I had another solution." And she said, "I didn't take the pills." I said, "What did you do?" She said, "I called up and I ordered Chinese food." So she didn't have to make dinner. And she said to me, and she didn't take the pills. So she did another displacement, but a much healthier displacement, a much one that was closer to doing a direct thing.
Right.
Then she didn't have to take them. And that's sort of how you can manage your addiction. If you can't totally prevent it, you can always manage it.
Right, and that's kind of what I did as I switched from food to exercise, and it seems to work for me, and exercise is kind of good for you anyway, so I don't mind it. Do you think, though, that because I'm fascinated, if I wasn't almost 60 years old, I would go back to school and become get a PhD in addiction, because I find the brain so fascinating. But do you think that these addictions, I know you say it's not the dopamine they're seeking, because we get that just from other ways. Everyone gets it, whether they're addict or not. But do you think that sometimes using these substances either harm or compromise the brain that make it harder? So for example, if somebody is going to drink, it doesn't affect their brain to make it harder to not drink again, because once they've had that exposure. Like I personally don't drink alcohol, so I never crave it. But people, once you get kind of the way I've heard it is once you've tested the waters of addiction, it's sometimes hard to swim back to shore.
Well, it's complicated. I think part of it is habit. Mm-hmm. So if as you pointed out, so if let's say it's eating. So let's say you are used to eating too much at a certain meal. You always do it. So to some extent, that's going to be part of your routine, and you're going to feel like doing it because you've done it before. That's habit. That has no deeper meaning. It's not a compulsion. That part you can control with willpower once you decide. But that's the least of the problem, right? So I don't believe that let me start with what I do believe. There's no question that there is a truth in the dopamine business. That is true, as I keep saying. The problem is that doesn't explain addiction. Uh-huh. So the brain changes that occur in people, for example, if you have alcoholism, the brain changes that occur are that if you are exposed to alcohol again, you will have a secretion of dopamine, in your brain. So you will get somewhat more excited. That's what they think is the disease. But the problem is, as an idea, is that that fails to explain all the data. It fails to explain, as you said, why people are able to stay abstinent. And we know that lots of people with alcoholism are able to sit around a group of people who are drinking and not drink. So there is something of that. But the difference, the reason it doesn't apply, the reason they think it applies is because these experiments were done in rats. And rats are different from at least most people. So rats, if you do this, if you addict them to heroin, which is what they originally did, then they will go and you give them a cue associated with the heroin, something like the Pavlov ringing the bell. You do something like that, then if you just ring the bell, they will run around like crazy looking for heroin. That's what Pavlov discovered with his dogs. And what they discovered is that the reason they're running around like crazy is because they have more dopamine in their brain. If people were the same as rats, then the idea would be true, because we would have no higher function. We would have no capacity to think. We would have no psychology, really. So we would be stimulus response creatures. See it, do it. You know? But people aren't rats. And so to the extent...
Well, some are.
Yeah, I know. Let's not talk about that right now. But the whole Vietnam experiment showed that that isn't true, because they all used a huge amount of heroin, just like the rats.
Wow.
They all got physically addicted. But when they were detoxed, when they were safely taken off heroin, practically none of them ever used it again. They should have had a rise in them that made them, whenever they saw a cue, and there were plenty of cues, you know, anything that was stressful in the war might have been stressful at home, just like with PTSD. Plenty of cues, but they didn't use heroin. Why? Well, they may have had some dopamine excretion, but they didn't have the psychology for it. They didn't need to do it. So when they got upset by something, they could deal with it directly.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in your book, Breaking Addiction, when you talked about the man that was an alcoholic, he had, like, the boss gave him extra work, and but what was interesting is he was able to delay his drinking until a later time, but that once he made the decision that many hours later he was going to drink, it calmed him down. And I see that with people that are food addicts, that maybe they can't get whatever it is that they're craving, but once they decide that after work they're going to binge on such and such, it's almost like they begin to feel better even without doing the behavior, which I thought was absolutely fascinating.
It is, and actually that was one of the first things that got me tuned into how this works, because I was trying to understand why people felt better without actually taking any drug or eating or doing anything. And so I understand that now, because merely making the decision means you're no longer helpless.
That's very important what you just said. Yeah.
And people usually do go on, you know, if they're not doing something to prevent it, or if they don't understand it, then they do go on to do it. But exactly what you said, it happens all the time. When I lived in Boston, for example, it took about an hour and a half to get to the nearest casino. And I ran a gambling clinic, so I saw lots of people who were compulsive gamblers. And it was exactly what they described. Once they said, I've got to go place a bet, they got in their car, and they weren't going crazy. They weren't like the rats. There was no dopamine release for an hour and a half. That doesn't happen. They were calmly driving down, and then they would bet then. But if you had interrupted them on the way between Boston and casino, which was in Connecticut, if you had stopped them on the road and said, you can't bet, you would have gotten an earful from them. You would have been stopping them on the path toward doing something that they felt they had to do. And all the rage, which is normal, by the way, it's rage. It's normal to be enraged at helplessness. All that rage would come out, be directed at you now. They would say, get the hell out of my way. I'm going to do it. And people experience this with addictions all the time.
Oh, I can remember that when, you know, because with my eating, I was anorexic and then bulimic. I've been okay for a while now, don't worry. But I can think about when I used to binge, it was like, if you're in my way when I got to get whatever I needed, I would not kill you, but you know what? I understand that feeling of rage and helplessness when you're trying to get your fix, you know?
Right. That's right, because you're being made helpless again by not being being allowed to carry out the displacement.
Absolutely. This is God. This I just are you the only one that is a proponent of this or teaching this? Because I will tell you that my brother is a Beverly Hills psychiatrist. He's practiced psychiatry for 40 years. And while he's not familiar with you or your work, I had mentioned to him that I was going to be interviewing and what your stance was. And he completely agreed with you in his practice and in general that the 12-step programs just do not work. So I'm wondering, are you like the lone wolf out there? Or are there other doctors or people that are teaching what you're teaching? Because for the people that you're going to help, it's going to be very valuable to know this information.
Right. Well, I'm sorry I don't know your brother, but I just moved out here from Boston.
Okay, that's okay.
I don't know that many people out here on the West Coast. But, well, am I the only one? I wouldn't say I'm the only one. I mean, for one thing, I learned from people who came before me who were writing. They weren't writing exactly what I said, but I had teachers who taught me about how to think about psychology, and I think they would by and large agree. And I've had the chance over many years now to speak, and I'm often asked to speak places. So I've talked in almost half the states in this country and most of the areas of Canada and in Europe. So I have a chance to talk. So I hear from people who have read my books, and I hear from people who are just in the audience. So I know that a lot of people have used this idea. The problem with getting more use is that there is a tremendous resistance in the official addiction community, because the people, most of them are interested in neuropsychology, which I have nothing against, but they don't like anything that criticizes the brain disease idea.
Right. And when I see something negative written about you, it's by these people.
Oh, yes.
But there's also their livelihood is dependent on it. And again, if these programs work for you, please do them. But when you think about it, to go to these addiction programs, like I had a client that came to me from an eating disorder program that was $10,000 a month, and she came to me fatter and sicker when she got out. And they're making a lot of money doing these treatment programs. I mean, I know that by and large, a lot of the 12-step programs are free, but a lot of people, this is their livelihood. And some of these programs are just so expensive that if you come along saying, hey, not so, people that are making their living at this might not be so thrilled if what you're saying is true.
Well, that's right. The academic people don't like it because it challenges their academic value.
That's why I like you, because I like people like you and Dr. John McDougall that are not afraid to go against what everybody's saying, because you know what? If you're right, it's going to be groundbreaking. You're going to help a lot of people.
Well, thank you. And the AA people, of course, don't like me either.
No.
But the AA is free, which is it's a good thing about it, I guess. Rehabs are not free, and as you point out, they are horribly expensive, and they're mostly fraudulent. I don't mind saying that, because our third book here, let me get my third book in here.
I'm so glad. No, yes, that's the one where I first heard of you.
That book was, besides being about 12-step programs, it was about rehabs. And the rehabs charge up to $90,000 a month.
Oh my! I don't even make that in a year.
And neither does most people.
Yeah.
But the tragedy is that they think that these places, because they're so expensive, the Betty Fords, the what do you call it? The Hazeldens, all those places, Sierra Tucson. They think that they are the best because they advertise. Everyone talks about them. But in many ways, they're the worst, because people spend a fortune trying to help their loved one, sometimes money they don't have. And then, because these programs have a terrible success rate, or they won't even report the success rate, which is even more common, they don't do well. Now, the poor person who's suffering with an addiction, on top of everything else, now has to feel that he or she has failed her family. They put all this money into it, and she couldn't stay on the wagon, kind of thing. And then they send them back for the same stupid treatment. And so what is the treatment? We published this in the book. It's public information. We published the Betty Ford Daily Schedule. So we know exactly what they do. And what they do is they have, things like trust falls. They have horse therapy, which means being around a horse. They have some groups. Groups are good, but not the way they run them, because they're mostly educational groups. They're not groups to figure out what's wrong with you. They have meditation, all these things. They just pile in everything that they can. And of course, they're 12-step based. And none of these things have any relevance to the treating the addiction. So they're charging a lot of money because they compete with each other. So they all have gourmet chefs. They have beautiful settings. The places in Malibu are famous for having all the actors go there. But what they're famous for is their luxury, and luxury doesn't treat addiction.
Right.
Passages Malibu, which is one of the famous ones, they charge $90,000 a month. And one of the things you're paying for is they actually own a yacht. It's called the Safe Passage, and so you get to ride on the yacht. So when they've been asked, what does having a yacht have to do with treating addiction, their answer is, it gives people a sense of what the sober life can be like. I mean, it boggles the mind.
Wow.
So I say these are fraudulent because, and the final thing, of course, is that the staff is not particularly well trained. It isn't like they are hiring people who are well trained in human psychology. Most of the people have limited training, or their only training is in the 12 steps, which is,
right.
so the treatment program that they offer is something called TSF, which stands for 12-step facilitation. TSF is 12 steps. As the name implies, 12-step facilitation. The whole purpose of it is to get you into AA. So it has no more success than AA itself, which is 5%.
Right. And like I said, so AA success rate is 5%, which you could maybe argue that the other addiction programs have a similar success rate. But even these very expensive programs that are $90,000 a month, don't they have a very low success rate? And also, isn't the recidivism rate very high?
Yes. And that's why most of these people won't release their results. In 2007, the Los Angeles Times did an expose on all the Malibu places, talking about how their staff was not particularly competent and they had no results on which to claim they all claim they're the best.
I'm surprised nobody's put a hit on you yet from these places.
Well, you know what? I don't think that. I mean, they are City Hall, and I'm fighting against City Hall. Right. So I don't think they see me as much of a threat.
Well, you know what? I love people like you because you remind me of one of my heroes, Rosa Parks, because if people don't challenge the status quo, nothing's ever going to be changed. And again, I'm going to say this a million times. If a 12-step program of any type works for you, please keep doing it. But Absolutely. Dr. Dodes, I get emails every day from people. My specialty is in food. So these are people that are doing the 12-step food addiction programs from whom it's not working. And that's why I'd like to offer them another alternative. It's interesting because one of the things is I happen to personally believe in God. And I know that there's a lot of people known as atheists that don't. And one of the things about the 12-step program that at least people have told me they don't like is because they don't want to have to say that. Just like I didn't want to have to say, well, I'm powerless over my emotional health. And because of that, which for people from which it works, that religious and spiritual component is going to be wonderful. But for those that don't resonate with it, I find that some people have said that that's why they can't do the steps because they're not going to claim that one.
Well, it's interesting. The research about, if you look at the other side of the coin, who does do well in 12-step programs?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, how do we know if we're a person that should consider a 12-step program?
Right. So all the research shows the same thing, and you're bringing up the spirituality as an example. People who can identify with this stuff, who buy into it, and it's not just the spirituality, but the whole higher power idea, for whatever reason, and we can talk about why they buy into it, but for whatever reason, those people do the best. Now, the reason they do the best is not because the 12 steps themselves have anything at all to do with addiction. But they do the best for the same reason that groups work for everybody in general. Camaraderie,
brotherhood, just like my program. We're a tribe. We're family. We got each other's back.
Exactly, and that's very important to human beings. And that's why things like grief groups work. I mean, you want to be with people who are going through something similar. And if you can make that identification and feel supported, that's helpful. But that's why it works. It's not because that has anything to do with addiction. It would work just as well or just as poorly if they changed it and they said, we're now going to talk about some other topic, So that's the 5%. 5% of people can make a lot of use of that, and those are the people who do well. And, as we keep saying, if it's working for you, do it.
Is there a way to know if you're that 5%? So let's say somebody that's just finding this video today acknowledges that they have an addiction. So before they decide to go here or there, is there a way that they could maybe with some introspection, decide, like, how do we know, is a 12-step program right for us without having to go through it if it, in fact, will harm us or just not help us?
Right. And so the answer for that, and naturally this question comes up a lot, and I say to people, try it. It doesn't bother me. Go ahead and try it. But don't ever feel you have to buy into all of it. For example, if you can use some of it, the camaraderie, wonderful. But one of the problems with AA is that they do expect you to buy all of it. It's all in, and that's why they accuse people who can't make use of it that they're not working hard enough. What they really mean is they're not buying the program. And so I would say to somebody, if you like it, go find a meeting you like, great. Go vaya con Dios.
I believe your research showed that more people become sober from means other than AA. That wasn't that a greater success? Yeah.
Well, actually, there's the spontaneous remission rate has been studied for alcoholism. We know how many people who have a verified diagnosis of alcoholism, just stop. That number is also about 5%.
Wow.
So make of it what you will. And we also, there are reasons why people stop, and there are reasons why people buy into this, which we don't have to go into. But as I say, it's mostly important to know that, to understand that if it's not working for you, don't go back.
Right. Exactly. That would make sense. So are you familiar with a movie that came out in 2012 starring Denzel Washington called Flight, where he was an airplane pilot that was addicted to cocaine and alcohol? It was a really good movie. He was nominated for an Oscar. Are you familiar with that at all?
I heard of it, but I didn't see it.
Well, the reason I bring that up is because it wasn't until I saw that movie that I realized, or at least that I believed or felt, and maybe I was wrong, maybe I never was an addict, I was just displacing a behavior, but that I felt that, I had a problem with food. And in the movie, he's clearly an alcoholic. And so he goes to AA and he gets all mad at his girlfriend. And he comes back and he's saying to her, I am not an alcoholic. I am not an alcoholic. I just choose to drink. And I thought that was very interesting because I have a person I know that is an alcoholic, and they told me that it's not their fault, but that one of their parents was an alcoholic and that they had absolutely no choice but to drink. And so I'd like to know how you feel about those two different people saying these things, because my feeling is even if you bought in, I don't want to say buy in because I'm not sure how I feel about this yet, but even if you believe that the reason you're an addict is because you have a brain disease or genetic predisposition, it's possible to still not drink. So in other words, if you didn't take that first drink, alcoholism would not have manifested.
Yes. But not to repeat myself, but I don't think that those ideas are true. And one of the things, once you understand addiction from an emotional standpoint, then you can see that, to use your example, let's say you had let's take Native Americans. I'm not completely clear about how much alcohol consumption there was before Columbus, but we know that there has been an enormous increase in alcoholism among Native Americans in recent years and for a long time. And that was one of the reasons, by the way, why some people thought that gene, which is present, gene defect, which is present in Native Americans, might have something to do with it. It doesn't. It's the opposite, as I said. So when you introduce alcohol to a population that hasn't been exposed to it, you will find that you will have more alcoholics because they were zero before. But what you're finding is that all the people who manage their lives in other ways or with other addictions or compulsions may turn to that. So the Native American population drinks more because a lot of them live in poverty and they have desperate lives and they have a lot of helplessness, and they're, for the same reason that the poorest areas of America in general have more alcoholism. But it isn't the alcohol and it isn't their brains. Their brains are no different. It's something else. And if you took people who are alcoholic, for example, and you put them in a place where there's no alcohol but everything else, it's for sure that they will feel helpless and they'll find another solution. Which is why, as you pointed out, AA meetings not only were filled with donuts, but they were filled with cigarettes. You could die from the smoke in them. Not so much anymore because of the change in the culture.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that the same thing happened with gambling. used to be that the diagnosis of compulsive gambling was said to be a diagnosis of men. There were no women practically.
Oh, I know one. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that shifted about 20 or 30 years ago, and now there are an equal number of people, of men and women, who have the diagnosis. So what changed? Did their brains change? Of course not. What happened was that the kinds of betting that men do, women didn't do.
Like football, for example. Yeah.
Right, or dogs. But when the lottery became popular, that's an equal opportunity source for gambling. And just as many women as men now had an opportunity to use this particular displacement, you might say, and they did. But their brains were always the same.
Right. So people feel a profound sense of helplessness, and they don't want to feel that, so they turn to myriad addiction to feel better or to displace that.
Or to do something so that they're not helpless.
So they do something that...
I want to stress that it's not necessarily to feel better.
It's not to feel better, because sometimes it makes you... Because it can make you feel worse, actually. Yeah.
It always makes you feel worse later.
Right.
And even at the time, I'm not saying there's no enjoyment in having that piece of cake, but I'm sure that you have. I've seen so many people who tell me that even while they were doing it,
they didn't feel good.
They were hating themselves and unhappy.
Right. Absolutely. Are there people in life that feel profound senses of helplessness, but that don't engage in addictions?
Yes, because addictions are just one way that we all have of managing our feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you another quick anecdote.
It's a great way to look at it, because it's really simplifying that. If people would just know that when they got the urge, if they could just look within themselves and realize what they were really feeling. But it seems like people don't want to look within. They're afraid that if they open up Pandora's box, maybe they were abused in childhood or traumatized or whatever, that they're just not going to recover if they look within.
Yeah, it's the opposite. They won't recover as they don't, because they have lifelong addictions, unfortunately.
Right.
But let me give you a different anecdote that addresses this, which I think is also in the book. I was treating a woman who also had alcoholism. And she also, similar to the other woman, she had a domineering husband. In this case, what he did was he said to her, "Here's an envelope, something I want you to mail today. Go mail it." And he left. And it was just an envelope, not a big deal, but it bothered her because it was an example of everything she'd ever done. But she didn't drink. What she did was she lost the envelope.
I remember that story in your book, yeah.
And then, this is absolutely true, and then she found the envelope, and then she lost it again. So from a psychological standpoint, we can all understand that she was losing it on purpose, except that it wasn't on purpose, it was unconscious. She was doing something to deal with her resentment and her fury at having to follow this man's orders. But it was another symptom, you might say. We have a name for it in my field. We call it a parapraxis, but that doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. It's something that you do unconsciously that reflects something that you feel, okay? So that's why she lost the letter. But she didn't drink. If she had not lost the letter, she probably would have had a drink.
Interesting. Do you think? Oh, sorry. Yeah, do you think that addiction is an equal opportunity destroyer as far as men and women, young, old, different races? And do you also think that things predispose us, like for instance, maybe early childhood trauma, or is this just a level playing field with who gets an addiction and who doesn't?
Well, it certainly is equal opportunity. There's no difference between the only differences are in choice of addiction.
Sure.
I mean, that's like with the gambling. There are not that many women whose compulsive gambling is about horse racing, for example. But the problem is the same. I'm sorry, what was the second part?
Well, do you think that possibly some of our life experiences, maybe like, I know a lot of women that have had sexual abuse or incest or early childhood trauma, does that prime the pump? Does that make us more likely to develop an addiction when we've had certain life experiences? Or is it just one of those things that we feel helpless, now we need to displace that with an activity?
You know, I would say, I want to say two things. First of all, it used to be, you know, people thought of folks with addictions as being somehow different or even in the gutter, that sort of thing. That's completely untrue. So part of the answer is that you can be quite emotionally healthy and still have an addiction. It's not true you certainly don't have to be crazy, and you don't even have to be that troubled. So as far as early trauma goes, of course, that's horrible for everybody. Mm-hmm. It may lead you to have an addiction. It might lead you to have something else, though. because these are all different symptoms that people have. They're not like diseases.
So addiction is a symptom, it's not a disease.
Absolutely. And for that reason, you can substitute, as the woman who lost the envelope, you can substitute another symptom. It happens all the time.
Right.
So I would say, I wouldn't want to say that people with addictions all suffered early trauma. I would say that they all have something that bothers them, which makes them feel overwhelmingly helpless. But it's just not true that everybody is the same. Right. So there are people who are, as I say, quite healthy and highly functional, but who have an addiction. And the other thing is that we often say an addiction is severe because its consequences are severe, which I understand. But in fact, if you're trying to treat somebody or treat yourself, what really makes it hard is the cause of the addiction, not the result. Here's another illustration. If you are treating somebody who's a billionaire, and we seem to have a lot of them around, who is a compulsive gambler, and if he goes into a casino and loses $10,000 a night, it's pennies to him. So he is suffering no consequences. But the addiction may be quite serious. I mean, he may be somebody who's difficult to treat because maybe he did have a lot of early trauma. Maybe there's something terribly, seriously troubling him from the standpoint of his mental health. But in his case, it just doesn't produce any problems. So I just want to separate the consequences from the causes. And I definitely don't want to create addicts as a group that's somehow sick or different.
And I think part of it, people don't like that word. I mean, so many people, whether they are or they aren't, they hate that word. You know, it's just...
I hate it too, actually.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I hope I can articulate to you verbally what is in my brain, because I just had an epiphany because I'm learning so much from talking to you. So I work in the field of plant-based nutrition with some very well-known doctors that have reversed heart disease, even end-stage heart disease, like Dr. Caldwell B. Esselstyn Jr. of the Cleveland Clinic, by changing a patient's diet. And in our country, heart disease is the number one killer of both men and women, and oftentimes a drug like a statin is prescribed. But that doesn't reverse heart disease. That reverses some of the symptoms. And it sounds to me like what you're saying is these 12-step programs, whether they're telling you to not drink alcohol or weigh and measure your food, are treating the symptoms, but not the cause of the problem. And so until we treat the cause of the problem that's creating that profound sense of helplessness, it almost doesn't matter what we do, because it doesn't seem like it's going to work for most people unless they deal with, in my field, what is eating them instead of what they're eating.
Right. Yes. And also, I want to be clear that if in the long run, in the breaking addiction, for example, I talk about short-term solutions and long-term solutions. Well, the long-term solution certainly is to work out what's bothering you, which really you need to see someone for. But there are lots of short-term solutions. Even before you work out everything, you really can master this symptom, and I think that's hopeful news.
Yeah, because I remember my partner John Pierre, who runs my Ultimate Weight Loss program with me. One of the things he said the first night to the participants, and I don't know if you live it, he said, "Until you fix this, you won't be able to fix this." So that's amazing. So one of the things that you said that I thought was really interesting is how, because I'm not familiar with AA, so again, if it's working for you, please go. We're not here to bash AA. We're here to help people that aren't helped by 12-step programs, is that they make the participant feel bad for not following the program. And I don't want to get into that trap with my program. I don't know if I've said this. If I do, I'm going to certainly apologize and not say it, because I do believe that at least with the eating, I recommend that it does work if people do it, but it's not addressing why they can't do it. But I do find that whether it's my program or just people I meet on the street, that when people do relapse from whatever it's from, whether it's alcoholism or drugs or food, they feel horrible. And they feel horrible at themselves. So what people say to me, "Oh, Chef AJ, I was so good today. I ate kale. Chef AJ, I was bad. I ate a cookie." And I try to explain to them that you're not bad if you eat one way and you're not good if you eat another way. You're either compliant or not compliant. But please don't put your judgment about how good you are as a person. But people with addictions do seem, I don't know if it's accurate to say they have lower self-esteem, but they do seem to feel very bad about themselves when they have addictions. They feel less than, or like they're really, whether it's a brain disease or not, they still feel like there is something deeply and profoundly wrong with them. And I would like to make people feel hopeful and better about this, especially if they relapse. So maybe you could address that.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, and I say that to my patients all the time, that I expect them to relapse because it's the usual way. And it's not fair to expect them not to relapse in a certain way. I mean, what if you had somebody who was coming in with depression and you said, good, don't be depressed anymore. If you're depressed anymore, you should feel terrible about yourself. It's ridiculous. In fact, I reverse it. I say to people, not only am I interested in understanding what happened when you relapsed, but I'm interested what you even think about relapsing, because it's the same thing. We can understand the things that go into it. So yes, and one of the problems with AA is that, well, I'm not saying they're trying to do this, by the way. They're not intentionally trying to harm people. But, they've got this chip system where you get a chip at 24 hours of sobriety, and then at a week and a month and a year. And the way the chip is supposed to work is it's supposed to make you feel better. You keep the chip in your pocket, and it reminds you of how many days of sobriety you have. The problem with it is, if you have even a drink, you go back to zero.
Zero, right.
You have no chance. And I can't tell you how many people are deeply hurt and enraged, appropriately so, to say, you're telling me I'm nowhere again? I'm back at square zero?
That would be that would feel very demoralizing to me, because I've been abstinent from sugar, flour, and I never drink since January. I remember the day, January 12th, 2012. And I did have one relapse, but I don't let that one day define the 5 years that I've been doing fantastic.
Absolutely. And it's the same is true for every addiction. I couldn't agree more. And again, it's one of the things about AA. So there's nothing wrong with having an abstinence-based idea as a goal, but it should not be a moral goal. It's not a question of you're bad if you don't do it. We're all struggling through life. You do the best you can. You try to learn from it.
How do you make people recover from, not make them, but how do you encourage them to feel better after a relapse, to get back on track, whatever their program is, and not to, do you have a system or a technique? Do you say to people like, okay, because to give you an example, it's like, and you may have heard this with your patients, I don't know, because I'm dealing only with food, not alcohol, but to give you an example, somebody will relapse or whatever you want to say. I don't even like that word necessarily, but they'll slip. They're on a program, they're doing well, something maybe happened, and they ate a cookie or a piece of cake. And so they say to themselves, well, I ate a piece of cake, now I may as well eat the whole cake. And to me, I don't understand that, because I've chipped a tooth once eating popcorn and needed a crown, and I didn't say, well, I chipped a tooth, so let me just get a hammer and chip the other 31. So what is that thinking that people with this addiction or proclivity towards this do? They say, well, I messed up, so now I may as well just fail miserably and keep failing and continue.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two parts to that. I think the reason that people would say, one reason is I ate the cake, I might as well eat the whole cake, is because, of course, within them, understandably, there's still a wish to eat the whole cake. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of removing a barrier to something that was already there. It would be helpful if they knew in advance that, yes, you're going to want to eat the whole cake. So this is not a surprise, and eating one piece of it doesn't change anything. But the other thing about it is what we're saying. People feel as if they've crossed some line, but there is no line. I've said exactly what you said to people. The problem with the AA token system is that instead of going back to zero, if you've had no episodes of the addiction for, let's say, 6 months, and you have one episode, you're doing great.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
So people need to understand that they're still doing great.
Right.
And then I don't think they will feel so terrible. But the way to do it is to grasp the whole concept, because it's going to happen. May not, but you're certainly going to think about it. And then use that. Use that to understand what led it to come to mind.
Right. How important do you think our environment is to our healing or overcoming addiction? So to give you an example, even though we know from you that the heart of addiction isn't the addictive substance, it's the feeling of profound helplessness. If you have a proclivity towards alcohol, or let's say you have a proclivity towards hyperpalatable treats, would it still be prudent to not have these things in your home?
Well, that's a good question. Yes. Would it be prudent? It's prudent, but food is the best example of this. You can't not have food.
Right, but you could choose to not buy mint chocolate chip ice cream.
Yes.
If that's your favorite treat.
So what I would say is, if you are a person who's trying to not buy chocolate chip ice cream or other things like it, and you're in the supermarket and you find yourself drifting toward the aisle, that's the time when you should say, I'm drifting toward the aisle. What's going on inside of me and in my life that's making me, because you're on the path. One of the things I talk about toward the addiction, I talk a lot about the key moment in addiction. And the key moment is the moment that you first start to move down that path, which is always before the addiction itself.
Mm-hmm.
So if in that sort of case, the person might say, I'm drifting toward the ice cream aisle. I wonder, this is the first time it's coming to my realization. So this is my key moment. So let me stop for a second. I can always get the ice cream, but let me stop and think about, why am I doing this thing? Oh, I know why. And then, my son's teacher just gave me a hard time about not having him dressed right. And that bothers me. That always bothers me. So instead of getting the ice cream, I'm going to write a little text to the teacher saying, I will take care of this in the future, but don't bug me, or whatever it is. Then you don't have to have the ice cream.
So deal with what's really bothering me. Now,
Yes.
Can people see you? Are you in private? I mean, or is this just, I so appreciate your time for this interview, but if someone was inspired by you, could they make an appointment either in person if they live in LA or via Skype if they don't?
They can certainly make an appointment with me if they're in LA. The problem with people outside of, it's a question of the laws in the country.
I see.
I can practice where I have a license, and it's not where the person lives, but where it's right. So I have two licenses because I still maintain my Massachusetts license from all my years in Boston and California. But if you're not in Massachusetts or California, I can certainly talk to people, but I can't treat them legally.
Understand.
That's going to change, by the way, because everybody in the country is doing this.
Telemedicine, sure.
Yeah. But at the moment, it's not. You can't quite do that. But again, that's why I wrote my book, so people can read about it, and then they can. What I do suggest to people is that if they take a look at the book and if it makes sense to them, they can use that to call therapists. And I have some suggestions about how to do that. And call them up, and there's nothing wrong with asking somebody, what is your approach? Or tell them, look, I understand, this is how I understand addiction. I think it's a response to overwhelming helplessness. You get enraged and you displace it. That's how I think it works. And if the person says, well, that isn't the way I think, you can say, thank you very much, and hang up. I mean, you will find people in a general, this is going to be tough to say, but most of the people who call themselves addiction specialists, unfortunately, believe in they either are 12-step people or they're brain disease people. So you have to be extra careful with them. But if you go to find somebody who's just a good therapist, I'd rather have you find somebody who's a very, very good therapist who knows nothing about addiction than somebody who says they're an addiction expert and really knows nothing about the psychology of addiction. So there are groups, there are psychology groups, there are psychoanalytic institutes all over the country, there are psychology groups all around the country. And I'm specifically not saying psychiatry, even though I'm a psychiatrist, because too many psychiatrists will give you a pill, unfortunately. And that we hope that they don't do that.
Right.
But you can shop around, and I'm glad that I've gotten lots of calls from people saying, I live in Seattle, who do you suggest? Occasionally I actually know somebody, but if I don't, I would just
That's
say
fantastic.
the same thing.
You've just blown my mind. You've given me so much to think about. It just makes me want to reread your books again now that I've talked to you, because some of these concepts are making more sense. And because we live in the same city, if people like this interview, which I will be happy to give to you and I'll post on YouTube after it goes out to my mailing list, I'd be happy to interview in person, doing something called a Facebook Live broadcast where we would go out to the whole world in real time. And they could even ask you questions based on this.
Sure.
And so thank you so much. I appreciate what you're doing. I know that some people are going to be really pissed off at what you say, but other people are going to resonate with it and maybe get the help they need to displace this feeling of powerlessness, which becomes, for many people, an addiction. So it was such a pleasure talking to you, Dr. Lance Dodes, and I really recommend you read his books, The Sober Truth, The Heart of Addiction, and Breaking Addiction, which probably is my favorite of the three because it kind of tells you what to do, I love how-to books. Thank you so very much. Thank you all for watching. I'm Chef AJ, and I make healthy taste delicious.